Morning, glory, America, bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside Studio West on this Friday, the 3rd day of February in the year of our Lord 2023. Good morning to you. Good luck to you in the Northeast as the worst wind chill in decades, according to the New York Times, is headed your way. About a dozen daily cold temperatures are likely to be broken over the next several days, primarily on Saturday morning, according to the New York Times. Winds gusting to 30 to 40 miles per hour, combined with temperatures well below freezing, will make conditions in some places extremely dangerous. So stay safe out there, as they used to say on Hill Street Blues. I'm Hugh Hewitt, and of course, yesterday I interviewed Donald Trump, so there are dozens and dozens and dozens of stories about that interview. None of them, as far as I can tell, not one legacy media story covered the Columbia Journalism Review series of articles this week on the journalism malpractice that was the Steele dossier at Russia. It's a 4-part series. I discussed it with the former president yesterday, and at the bottom of the hour, I'll be playing the portions of the interview that you did not hear on the show yesterday. All of it is available at my podcast, Highly Concentrated Hugh, along with yesterday's interview with Larry Hogan, which also made news. But I simply point out to you that dozens and dozens and dozens of articles by legacy media about what Donald Trump said to me, various parts of it matter to various outlets. Not one covered the Columbia Journalism Review exchange, even though it is the big story of the week in the world of media, and I talked about it with the former president. Other things going on right now. Why haven't we shot down the Chinese spy balloon? Headline, Washington Post, Chinese spy balloon flying over U.S. right now, Pentagon says. New York Times, Pentagon says it detected a Chinese spy balloon hovering over Montana. Wall Street Journal, Chinese spy balloon tracked over the U.S. this week. So we know it's there, but Joe Biden doesn't want to upset the Chinese, so we're not taking it down. Let them spy on us. It's over Montana right now, and it's charting wherever we've got silos and whatever else we've got there. And it's just spying, and it's sort of like a U-2, only we could bring it down. Only Joe Biden won't. Somebody wake the president and wake him again. And a third time, tell him that, there's a Chinese spy balloon over the United States. What do we do? And he'll say, what Chinese spy balloon? He'd been briefed on it yesterday. The New York Times is trying to cover the incredible weakness of Team Biden with a story that begins, Biden aims to deter China with greater U.S. military presence in the Philippines. Well, I am very glad that General, now SecDef Austin, went and got a base agreement. You got to put people at those bases, and you got to be prepared to back it up with military power. And that means serious funding of the Pentagon above 2023 levels with more than an inflationary increase. There's been no such rhetoric coming out of the White House. They don't believe it. This is all for show. Representative Ilhan Omar was ousted from the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday. That's good. I've got a story over at the Washington Post. My column on the party, the GOP, is up, and it's drawn 1,000 negative comments, I'm sure, already. But it talks about how becoming the party of parents and students is the GOP's goal. The unanimous agreement of everyone I talk to is that we've got to break the back of public education's malfunction, malpractice, dysfunction. And that it's worth your reading. It's over at the cover page of WashingtonPost.com. Just look for the Hugh Hewitt column titled, The GOP is in much better shape than you'd think. Soaring death toll gives grim insight into Russian tactics. It is now estimated, according to the New York Times, that 200,000 Russians have been killed or very badly wounded in Ukraine in less than a year. 200,000. Misleading headline here from the Washington Post. College Board faces storm of criticisms over AP African American Studies. I actually don't believe they face a storm of criticism at all. I know that they've got some academic critics and some ideologues who want to put the ideology back in that Ron DeSantis' Florida called out, in which the AP took out because the College Board realized that was just propaganda. So they quote storm of criticism, close quote. It's just a hard left hissy fit over the fact that the parents, students, and political people in Florida want no part of ideology in the classroom and of hating on America, which it's full of. Let me Generalissimo compiled a reel. It could go hours because, I tell people, Donald Trump's the best interview in America from a news person's point of view because he answers questions and he makes news. And then people decide what they want to talk about. They don't cover the whole interview if they didn't listen to it. But, of course, the transcript is posted at hughhewitt.com. If you want to listen to the whole thing and to Governor Larry Hogan, that's at Highly Concentrated Hugh on iTunes. That's different, by the way, from the universe. The content at the universe is exclusive to the universe, and you have to subscribe to the universe to get it, including the podcast on the Grand Old Party. But the Donald Trump interview is news, and so I put it, there's no paywall. It's just at iTunes, highly concentrated Hugh, or just do Hugh Hewitt in iTunes, and you'll find it. Here, however, is a summary, a little reel on national and local media referring to the interviews yesterday, cut number 23.
You always have to say you're going to support the nominee, except, remember, in 2015, that first Republican debate, Fox did, and I think it was Bret Baier said, raise your hand if you're committing to support the nominee. And Donald Trump was the only one who wouldn't. He would not commit. And in fact, today, Hugh Hewitt asked Donald Trump the same question. Take a listen.
If you're not the nominee, will you support whoever the GOP nominee is?
It would depend. I would give you the same answer I gave in 2016 during the debate. It would have to depend on who the nominee was.
Once again, the rules don't seem to apply to him.
Well, former Governor Larry Hogan still pretty tight-lipped over whether or not he will announce a run for the White House in 2024.
He was pressed about his intentions during an interview on the Hugh Hewitt radio show earlier today. And while he did not make any announcements about himself, he says he plans on supporting whoever the GOP candidate is, even former President Trump. He later clarified that, though, saying that he fully expects his party to pick someone other than Trump.
Former President Trump is not committing to backing the 2024 GOP nominee if he doesn't win the nomination contest. On conservative radio host Hugh Hewitt's show this morning, the former president railed against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who many expect to mount a 2024 bid. Trump claimed once again that DeSantis only became governor because of his endorsement. Trump also lashed out at other potential 2024 candidates, including former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former South Carolina Governor and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. Both, as you might have already gathered, were members of Trump's cabinet. Here's what Trump had to say when asked if he would support the 2024 GOP nominee.
It would depend. I would give you the same answer I gave in 2016 during the debate. It would have to depend on who the nominee was.
Former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, himself a possible 2024 GOP candidate for president, responded to Trump. In a tweet, he said, "To be clear, my position on Trump hasn't changed. Trump won't commit to supporting the Republican nominee, and I won't commit to supporting him. As I have repeatedly said, I fully expect to support the Republican nominee, who I don't believe will be Trump."
So just to begin to see the sort of effect that Trump has already, you have my buddy Maryland Governor Larry Hogan walking back some of the comments he made today on the Hugh Hewitt show, saying he would support whoever the Republican nominee is, even if it's Trump. Now, he's come back and clarified those remarks, tweeting, quote, "To be clear, my position on Trump hasn't changed. Trump won't commit to supporting the Republican nominee, and I won't commit to supporting him. As I repeatedly said, I fully expect to support the Republican nominee, who I don't believe will be Trump."
This could go on forever. None of them, nobody talks about the Columbia Journalism Review. One of the more important exchanges that I had with the former president about the new set of stories in the Columbia Journalism Review. And the reason they don't talk about it is it's very unflattering to the New York Times and very supportive of Donald Trump. And it's very fair. So, of course, legacy media is going to play other parts of the interview, which are also newsworthy, but they're going to ignore that, which makes them look terrible, which doesn't matter because they still look terrible. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I'll be right back on this Friday. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt to analyze the threat posed, if any, by the Chinese Communist Party's spy balloon over Montana, and to follow up on Chairman Mike Gallagher's comments about the need to shoot it down in the last segment. I am joined now by Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy, former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, star of stage and screen, and author of many fine books. But boy, we couldn't be more timely, Admiral. Mike Gallagher just said, shoot it down. What do you think?
I think, yes, shoot it down, but you do need to be mindful about where the debris lands. Would have been really good to shoot it down over Canada. And by the way, as you know, Hugh, but some of the listeners may not, the United States and Canada are joined together in a massive air defense zone. That's what NORAD is, North American Air Defense. So would have been quite legitimate in consultation with our Canadian partners to knock it down somewhere over the tundra of Canada. Now it's over the United States. You have to be pretty mindful. I don't think we're in the business of shooting down a lot of balloons, so we're not sure exactly, I would suspect, how to go about doing that in a way that ensures the debris doesn't go somewhere. But, it's a big Western United States. I bet we could figure that out. So, yeah, I'll go with soon-to-be chairman Mike Gallagher. Let's shoot the thing down. And the reason being, let's see what's on it. Let's see what the capabilities
Admiral,
are.
I'm curious. I said it sounded to me like a Wile E. Coyote Acme device because it's just floating different places. Is there any way to drop a net over it and bring it down? Does it have to be a shoot down? Because I'd like to actually see what the machinery is and how it works and what they're looking at.
Well, I don't think we have a lot of recent experience shooting down balloons. You probably have to go back to World War I when we took out a few Zeppelins. But I think it's improbable we have the technology to drop a sheet over this thing. It's up there at about 20 miles. You can't get a helicopter up there. Things are zooming and zorching by it. Bottom line, Hugh, I wouldn't be surprised if we find out this is real buffoonery. We could call it balloonery on the part of the Chinese. I'm not sure they deliberately are driving this balloon over the United States. And they're kind of backpedaling themselves. But yeah, we shouldn't be in the business of allowing anything floating around over the United States from a foreign power.
All right, now I want to move to the headline I originally wanted to talk to you about. New York Times this morning is reporting that the Russians have lost 200,000 dead or seriously wounded troops. And the last public Biden administration statement was 100,000. What do you think of those numbers?
I think they're real. I'll tell you where I go for intel. The U.S. intelligence community and its public pronouncements tend to be pretty conservative, kind of understate. The Ukrainians, as you would expect, will have crazy big numbers. Look at British intelligence. They have successfully called an awful lot of things on the battlefield. I think that's where these numbers are coming out of. Let me put them in perspective for you and the listeners, Hugh. 200,000 killed and wounded in a year, 1 year, less than 1 year. Compare that to 20 years in the forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States had 7,000 tragically killed in action. So this is a gargantuan number. And oh, by the way, add to it the 200,000 to 300,000 young Russian military-age males who fled the country. I'd call them casualties also. They're not coming back. So you're really looking at a loss of probably 500,000 in that sense between those who departed the country and those who are killed or grievously wounded. That's a staggering blow. I'll close on this before we go too far with the high fives. Look how bad it's going for the Kremlin. Putin gave a speech yesterday calling the ghost of Stalingrad forward. Don't forget the Russians lost about 1 million in a year at Stalingrad. They're tough people. So, yeah.
Did he actually use that term? Because Stalingrad's been renamed. I mean, I'm just wondering, did he actually call the ghost of Stalingrad forward?
I think he did. Certainly that was what I believe was reported. I have not listened to the speech. It's a good question to ask. The city, you're absolutely correct, I've been there, is now called Volgograd for the river that runs through it. But I think he very deliberately did those echoes of Stalingrad. We ought to check that.
Admiral, I've never asked you this before. There's a movie about the siege of Stalingrad. I'm trying to remember what it is right now. The two snipers.
It's called Enemy at the Gates.
Yeah, I thought it was a very fine representation of the brutality of that battle. Did you?
I absolutely did. And what you see there is an absolutely ruined city, destroyed, twisted metal, small pockets going at each other. Meanwhile, huge tank battles in the center of what's left of it. It's a remarkable film that shows you this. And by the way, it's not just Russians who are killed there. There were probably 1 million Germans killed there. So this is a battle in which almost 2 million people die in the course of a year-long conflict. It's the bloodiest battle in history.
I bring it up just so that Americans know when the president of Russia refers to that, that means he's all in and he's staying all in, at least for public consumption. I saw that President Zelensky yesterday did two things. They had a sweep of the corrupt, which is good. And then they also announced they are preparing for an offensive that Russia seems to be mounting. I really don't know how much to credit the latter. I haven't read the British Ministry of Defense report on that. What do you think, Admiral Stavridis?
I think Putin will, in fact, launch a spring offensive. Personally, I think for him to start an offensive now, still kind of in the guts of winter with utterly untrained troops, is a prescription for disaster. Naturally, the Ukrainians are going to talk very aggressively about that because, Hugh, they want two more key things that I strongly believe the Biden administration can give them. One are ATACMS. It's an acronym for a long-range surface-to-surface missile, range of almost 200 miles, can go after Russian logistics inside the borders of Ukraine, and even more significantly, in my view, fighter aircraft, F-16s. It's time to put Ukrainian pilots in F-16s. It'll take a while to train them up. Should have started that 6 months ago, but here we are. Let's get it done.
That reminds me, Admiral, yesterday I did a very long interview with former President Trump, transcript and audio over at HughHewitt.com. Most of the media, including legacy media, completely ignored the conversation about the Columbia Journalism Review expose of the last week. But I began by asking him, if China sails ships towards Taiwan, do we sink them? His answer is, I'm not going to tell you, President shouldn't comment on that. Not a bad answer. But then he leaned against Ukraine. When I brought up the F-16s, he didn't back it. And there is a divide developing in the Republican Party. What he did do was talk about NATO's contribution. You're bipartisan. You're the chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation. You're not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm just curious, what do you think the public position ought to be for everyone on the center right and center left about military aid to Ukraine?
We ought to be 100% behind it, unreservedly. The Ukrainians were the ones invaded. They're the ones standing and fighting. They are delivering every single day. By giving them the tools to push back on this brutal invasion, we deter Russia. We contribute to the elimination of significant Russian military capability. It is nothing but good. And by the way, here's a point to be made. I have no idea what President Trump said. But if you look at contributions in billions of dollars, the United States has given more, but the European Union is very close to the United States, as they should be, because our economies are roughly the same size. And of course, they're located right there. But these conversations, for example, Hugh, about tanks, it's going to be 30 U.S. Abrams tanks. That's a good thing. It's going to be 100 or more European tanks that are going to go in there. Europeans are pulling their weight in this fight. NATO is pulling their weight in this fight. We got to recognize that.
You see, that's what I did not have the stats at hand. The former president was insisted on parity between NATO contribution, non-U.S. and U.S. NATO contribution. And you've just told me it is very close to parity. What about the first question, would we sink the ships, when he declined to answer and said presidents don't answer questions like that?
I think on that one, he's probably more in the right frame in that the U.S. policy, and I still think it's the right one, as you know, Hugh, is called strategic ambiguity. That is to say, we don't tell Beijing we're definitely going to attack your forces if they approach Taiwan, or we won't. We have strategic ambiguity. We create uncertainty in the minds of Beijing. By the way, that's why it's a very good thing, announced in the last couple of days, that the U.S. has gained access to bases in the northern Philippines. Look,
you anticipate where I'm going. That's 98 miles away from Taiwan, one of them. But how long will it take us to put... we used to have giant Air Force and Navy bases in the Philippines. They closed during the countries going in their opposite direction. How long will it take us to actually staff these things up that they're operationally of concern to the CCP?
Months, not years. And the way to think of it is we're not going to rebuild Clark Air Force Base or Subic Bay Naval Station or QB Point Naval Air Station. Those were huge, static Cold War bases. The vision now is to have lighter, faster, quicker logistics wellheads, places we can move, particularly Marines in. Commandant of the Marine Corps Berger has been, I think, brilliant on this. The idea of creating Marines as attack forces that can move inside that island chain. And by the way, little notice, Hugh, last week also, the Marine Corps commissioned its first new base in 70 years. It's in Guam, Fort Blaze. That'll be the wellhead, the logistics head, back behind those forward bases, for example, in the northern Philippines.
You know, Admiral, some of my Marine Corps buddies, we have a minute here, suggest that's camouflage for de-emphasizing our Okinawa footprint. What do you say to them?
I think it is not camouflage, but it is a true fact that we are rebalancing some forces, Marines and others, away from the Japanese home islands and putting them back on Guam. I think that makes sense if you look at the big picture here. And here's the other point, Hugh. By taking those U.S. forces out of Japan, it causes the Japanese to have the pressure that we want to raise their own defense budget.
That's another way of looking at it. As always, Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy. Follow him at Stavridis J on Twitter. Thank you for joining me. I'll be right back, America, on this Friday edition of the Hugh Hewitt Show. We've got to adopt this to the Chinese Communist Party. Come spy with me, Congressman and now Chairman Mike Gallagher calling for the shoot down of the Chinese spy balloon. I'm joined by Sarah Westwood, the Washington Examiner political and congressional reporter, for our weekly weekend review in the Congress. Sarah, do you think the Chinese spy balloon is going to be a big story on the Hill today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you already have Republicans coming out and criticizing how the Biden administration has handled this, how long it took them to acknowledge that the spy balloon is there, the fact that they're taking a wait and see approach instead of anything more aggressive. And, you know, you have Secretary of State Antony Blinken planning this upcoming trip to China. You have the Biden administration, you know, trying to project this sense of everything being under control on the foreign policy front ahead of Biden's State of the Union, where he'll have to sort of boast about his foreign policy accomplishments. So it's definitely putting the Biden administration in a difficult spot, and Republicans are definitely going to exploit that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if some of the Freedom Caucus bring balloons to the State of the Union. That would be a useful, a good visual. Sarah, it appears to me that the Congress is finally functioning. Chairman Gallagher, after he called for the shoot down of the balloon, went on to praise Hakeem Jeffries' appointments onto the Select Committee on China. I do believe it's a great slate of Democrats and Republicans. Every single person on that committee is serious. That's going to be different from every other committee that we have seen, which have been, you know, deeply partisan for since President Obama, actually since 9/11, it's been a partisan Congress after the initial bipartisanship. But that committee looks like it's actually going to work. What's your assessment of it?
Yeah, it was sort of bipartisan from the start, right? It was one of the only concessions, if you would call it that McCarthy made during his speakership bid that Democrats supported. It's, you know, got a bipartisan mission. There's, like you said, a strong crop of members from across the ideological spectrum on that committee. So I do think that's something that has the potential to yield, you know, some bipartisan interest. Now, sometimes where Republicans and Democrats want to get tough on China is different, right? I mean, you have more populist Republicans who want to continue Trump's sort of focus on the trade wars. You have Democrats who are not as interested in taking on the big tech companies that do their manufacturing in China in an exploitative way. So, you know, there might be some tension points because the priorities of both parties are so different when it comes to China. But I do think to the extent that there's an opportunity for something meaningful and bipartisan to get done, it's around that committee.
Now, Sarah, you can't be everywhere, so I don't know if you were anywhere near Adam Schiff this week, but the former Intel committee member has been removed by Kevin McCarthy, is now on the House Oversight, the Jordan Subcommittee, is the subject of a lot of the Columbia Journalism Review takedown of the Russia coverage by the New York Times and others, and the lies that Schiff told. Former President Trump on this program yesterday went after Schiff with a 2x4. Does anyone on the Hill know about the Columbia Journalism Review 4-part series that came out this week on Russia? Because it is very devastating for the legacy media.
It's very devastating, but I wonder if, you know, outside of journalism circles, it's having the same kind of impact. I mean, this is, you know, our industry, so it's been very interesting to see this sort of the first real sort of introspection from a serious and sort of mainstream journalism institution about everything that went wrong. And it's really devastating for the journalists who have still continued to refuse to acknowledge how wrong they were, that they were either misled or they willfully refused to seek out the truth. And it seems that, Adam Schiff supporters may not care about that. They think of him as something of a celebrity, a crusader against Trump, but certainly he doesn't have any credibility from, an objective standpoint left.
Yeah, I would love to see Chairman Jordan begin his hearings by calling forward the writers of that story just to review what they did. I talked about it at length with the former president, which got coverage everywhere, right? The Trump interview exploded. It's everywhere. Not one legacy media outlet covered the portion involving the Columbia Journalism Review. It's as though if they ignore it, it doesn't exist. But I know, and everyone who follows it knows, it was journalistic malpractice.
Right. I mean, they allowed themselves to be misled by people that they aligned with politically. I mean, every part of that story has been proven false, whether it comes to the influence of the bots on social media that were blamed for influencing the election to, the basis of the Russia investigation, all the way up to the personnel that conducted the Russia investigation, the head of the FBI counterintelligence unit that led the investigation against Donald Trump initially was just indicted for working with Russia himself. So there's no part of that story that hasn't.
Would you pause on that, Sarah? I have not covered that this week because I can't pronounce the names, and you have 1 minute. What? It's such a stunning story.
Right. So this is FBI former counterintelligence chief Charles McGonigal, who was just indicted by the Justice Department for taking money from a Russian oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, who had been demonized by the media and the press as a really just evil Russian oligarch with all these ties to Trump world. I mean, Paul Manafort got in trouble. Was indicted in part, for tax fraud and stuff, but also for work that he did with Oleg Deripaska that he also didn't disclose, just like this FBI leader who was investigating people for doing the same thing that he essentially later did. So it's a really flagrant
Sarah,
example.
you're so good at this. You don't miss anything. Sarah C. Westwood on Twitter, read her in the Washington Examiner. Hear her most Fridays here on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Thank you, Sarah. Have a great weekend.